you the thing, and I'll send it out and remind that too. So those are some of the things that I know eat up people's time, and that also keeps your confidence high, because it's not that you don't know how to answer the question; it's that the method that you're using is going to take a lot of time, and this is seeing if you've mastered things, right? And as you work in Aztec, and as we've had the class, you know where you struggle in. So as you're working, when you get to that section, you know how to manage your time. Make sense?
Yes. Yes.
Good, good.
Yes. Yes.
Perfect. Okay. Any other questions on that before we move on?
No question.
Okay.
No question.
Good. So you know you have about a minute and a half per section in math. Algebra is going to be the most important. Oh, okay. And actually, let's go back to the essay question real quick in writing. How many sections, or what are the 4 types of writing? Talked about this yesterday. The 4 types of writing.
About the essay.
Okay, well, that's when we're writing our essay, but there's 4 types. I'll give you one. Narrative writing. Go ahead.
Narrative, descriptive, expository.
Expository, yep.
Yeah, persuasive.
Out of all of those, which one is probably going to be the kind of writing you're going to do for the test?
It's persuasive.
Persuasive. Good. And besides taking notes and finding evidence, what's the most important thing to remember with persuasive writing? A mistake I see a lot of people make.
The evidence.
What's that?
Evidence.
Okay, yeah, sometimes people don't take notes. But remember, okay, so if you're writing a persuasive essay, you're trying to convince somebody that what you're saying is true. What's that?
Sound word.
Yes, you need that when you start your essay. But when you're trying to convince people, you need to pick a side. So if you're writing a persuasive essay, can you be in the middle and say both sides are right?
No.
No. Your essay has to pick a side. If you're reading an essay, if you're reading a text about uniforms in school and why they're good and why they could be bad, can you say, "Oh, uniforms are kind of good, uniforms are kind of bad"? Can you do that?
No.
No. You have to pick a side. So if you're saying uniforms are good, then your whole essay needs to prove that. If you're saying uniforms are bad, then your whole essay needs to prove that. Don't go in the middle. All right, that's the most important thing. So yes, find your evidence, make sure you can use it. Okay, so let's move on to science. Now, science is a reading comprehension test more than anything. All right, let me see if I can find the scores. Okay, all right. Sorry about that. Okay. So with the science portion, it's a reading comprehension test, and that's why we don't have classes that explicitly go over science. And in fact, I'm going to see if I can share. I should be able to share with you what a passing result looks like. Now, and all these things that we talk about when we say, hey, 40% is passing. If you do well in this section, you're going to do well in that section. That's not our opinion. Those are facts. So that's based off of everyone else who's taken the test. So I just want to make sure that's clear because I think sometimes people get the impression that we're just kind of saying these things, but it's all coming from data. So we look at when people pass, how did they pass, why did they pass, and that's why we don't teach science. That's why we don't teach history. I'm going to give you a quick way to understand American history in like 10, 15 minutes. All of American history, all 300 years. Okay. So I'm just going to go ahead and crop out. So I'm going to share just what the results look like. This is going to be math, and it might only let me email it. Okay, so let's save that. Okay, so I'm going to email out one. Okay. So what you're about to see is an edited version of the test results. I'm going to send one for math and then one for reading. Make sure I got everybody's email. Okay. So Sam, I know yours. Oh, wait. Okay. So I got some in there. Okay. And then Mariana, what is your email? It should remember. So if you give me the first part, and Alma, if you give me the first couple letters, it'll find it.
Es Mariana.Lopez.
Mariana.Lopez. Okay. And Alma?
Es Alma, D de Víctor, T de Tomás.
Okay. Hit the thing. Okay. So this is going to be the initial results. So, okay. Okay. So that one's going to be the math that I just sent out. Okay. So I just sent out the math. Let me send out the reading. Did everybody receive that?
Not yet. Yes, I received it.
Okay. So you see how it has all those different sections? That's the way that I also teach the class, where we start talking about all the different areas. So in those sections, depending on how you do in reading, if your reading comprehension is high, odds are that you're going to pass the science and that you're going to pass the social studies. I'm about to send you everyone the reading. Okay. So on the way now is going to be the reading portion. And then I'll give everyone like a few minutes to look at that. And then if you have any questions, then I can answer them. Town hall meeting. Okay, so I just sent that out. Okay, so I'll give everybody a few minutes just to look at that, so we're all on the same page. So what I want you to pay particularly close attention to when it comes to the reading, what's going to help matter the most is going to be the comprehension and the synthesis and generalization. If you look at this student, they got a 92% in comprehension and an 80% in synthesis. So they most likely passed the social studies and the science portion. Right? And also, what's the minimum score that you need to that's required to pass?
8.
Yeah. Right? So even if English is not your first language, it doesn't mean that you can't pass. And if nobody else has told you about it, they also offer a Spanish reading subtest, and the time is 80 minutes. So you can take the test in Spanish. Okay. Now, questions about that so far? Anything?
No question. No question. No question.
Okay. So science is 60 questions, 80 minutes. So you can figure out the time there. You got like a same thing, about a minute and a half for each question. Now, those social studies. Science, I do believe, is a reading comprehension test. The social studies, you're going to need some background on. So I'm going to give you 300 years of American history in about 10 minutes. And this has helped all of my students pass the test. Okay. All right, hold on. I'm going to move this over a little bit. Okay. So there's a couple of things that you have to understand about American history that are going to go beyond just reading comprehension. Okay. So I'm going to draw a map of the United States. This map is not to scale. Okay. And then we're going to say over here, you're going to have England, and then you'll have Europe. Okay. So the USA. Okay. We'll call this the UK. We'll call this Europe. Okay. So the most important things to remember, and hope everybody can see it through the YouTube video. Okay. So the most important thing to remember about the United States is that when people left the United Kingdom in Europe and they settled in all these little colonies on the East Coast, they were all being persecuted in Europe or the United Kingdom for several reasons. What's that?
United Kingdom.
Yes. Well, a lot of people also came from other parts of Europe. Right. So what it's important to know about the United Kingdom, Europe, is the fact that they were run by kings. And in their system, you had to be born into nobility. They had something called manifest destiny. You don't have to memorize that word, but manifest destiny basically means God chose you to be in charge and nobody else really has a choice. And that's the way everything ran. So everybody had a title, everybody had a position, and the people who had the lowest titles, lowest positions had almost no rights. So you couldn't practice your own religion. It was almost impossible for you to buy land. There was a lot of oppression. So when people came from Europe and UK to the United States, they were able to get away from some of the control because the king, the monarchy, could not control the colonies as well as they could when you're on the land, right? So a lot of our laws, in fact, all of our laws are really meant not to interfere with anybody's rights. That is huge in America. So you had things like the Mayflower Compact, the people that were coming to America on a ship literally were like, well, who's going to be in charge? We're getting away from the king. And the Mayflower Compact was an agreement that all men, white heterosexual men, were all created equal. That all men were created equal. All heterosexual men, white men, were created equal. So that was huge for them at the time. The fact that none of them came from nobility, they weren't connected to the king. And that's where the freedom really started. Now, obviously, you have women that were there. Obviously, you have slaves and other people of color that were there. Freedom's not going to apply to them for a while. In fact, as they started to allow other people the right to own land and vote, they would rather give it to men, black men, before they give it to any woman. So a black man was still better than a white woman, right? And then women are going to get the right to vote. Women are going to get the right to own land and universal suffrage. But then again, I'm sure you're probably thinking of a lot of other people that don't have rights. Okay. So it's going to be a while before those rights extend to everybody else because a lot of the ideas here in America were radical. So most of your social studies questions are going to deal with the best way to give everybody freedom and how much power the government has, right? So that's why they would do things like all the way out here in Oregon when they bought this land from the French, when they bought this land from Napoleon, to give the land away, they literally would just let people go out west, put a stick in the ground and say, that's your land, right? And there's a big fight over that. Now, that's the only way they thought it was fair. In fact, they were so afraid of a strong government because George Washington did not want to be king. He didn't want to be an emperor, but they were so afraid of having a really powerful government like a king would be or a queen would be that in the beginning, the government that controls what is the 13 colonies is very weak and can't really do anything. And they did that because they were so afraid of taking power away from other people. So our Bill of Rights is a way for the government to check itself. You can't get too powerful. All of those rules were pretty much things that the king was doing to keep other people from having power and other people from being able to live their lives, right? So, like even freedom of speech. Alexander Hamilton was a lawyer who represented another colonist who was saying really mean things about, I think it was the governor of Virginia. And when they went to court, normally the courts would always favor the king because that's just the way that it was. Now, in the colonies, things are a little different. The king doesn't have as much control over the colonies because the king's not there. So in that court case, they decided that you could say whatever you want as long as it's true, right? And then that's going to make its way into freedom of speech. That's going to evolve into some of the rules we have now. You know, the British used to force the colonists to put soldiers in their house when they're going to war. That's going to now evolve. That would then evolve into you can't come into someone's house without a warrant. The military can't enforce like police duties, things like that. All of that comes from the oppression of the king. Even our court system. You know, even now, there's people all over the world that wait years in jail just to get a court date, right? Well, we have it in our Bill of Rights that you cannot be held for a long time without reasonable, what's that called? Jurisprudence. Like you can't just be held in jail without ever having a court date, and there's limits to the time, right? You had to have a speedy trial. So those are all things that came from the exact opposite of the way the king ran the country. The idea that you don't have to be forced to essentially snitch on yourself, right? You don't have to testify against yourself. Well, that also comes from the king because the king would torture people into accepting that they did something wrong because it would help out the king with whatever goal they had, whether it's taking land, war, combining empires, whatever. So all of those rules that you're going to read about were meant to keep the government from getting too strong. If you hear people arguing, they're going to be arguing about what the government should do to allow people to have the most amount of freedom. And there's a lot of fights with that. Some people really like the way that England did things, even though there was a king. Some people like the way France started to do things. But that's going to be 90% of the social studies test is those ideas, why we have those laws. And if you read about anybody from the American government, you know how they're going to feel. Questions about that?
No question.
Questions?
No question. No question.
Okay. So that's pretty much the social studies test. There's not going to be anything else. So the rest of it is going to be reading comprehension. Okay. So as we scroll down, okay, we're not going to get too much into the life science, the science, but as you can see, it does break down the percentage, and most of it is life science. Science is really going to be a reading comprehension test. We're not going to do that. Now, where you see where it says DOK level questions, DOK stands for domain of knowledge, and this is how difficult a question is. So a DOK level 1 question is like, photosynthesis is where plants turn energy from the sun or sun rays into energy. What is photosynthesis? That's a DOK level 1 question. That's recall. Level 2 is where they might ask you to think about how a car that uses gas, what kind of similarity does that have to a plant that uses energy from the sun? That's like a level 2 question. Level 3 is going to be asking you to like design a system that uses energy. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Right. And if you notice for science, most of the questions are at a level 2. That's why it's basically reading comprehension. Only 6% are going to be really simple. You read this, repeat what you read. And 28% is going to be high level, come up with something new type questions. Questions about that?
No question. No question.
Okay.
No question.
All right. So moving on. Okay. So now we're getting to history. Now, the Navy needs you. Don't read American history. Make it. And the question is, this poster was most likely designed to appeal to all of the following except a person's, right? And I think that one, again, is pretty straightforward. There's nothing in there about money. They're trying to make you defend your country. You're responsible for making history. Those are the types of questions that you're going to get. And they give you some other ones, which I'm not interested in. I want to get down to the sections. But you have practice history questions in there. So I'm going to scroll past all of that. Okay. So you have a lot of sample questions in this slide. I'm going to get past all of those, but on your own time, if you wanted to look at those, you could. Okay, so let's look at the breakdown. Okay. So when we look at the language arts, okay, and this is writing, what is the majority of the language arts test going to be about? And that's on slide 46. What is the majority of the language arts question going to come from? Where are they going to come from?
Literature.
Huh? Okay, so if you look at slide 46, 43% of your questions are going to come from language facility. Okay, so you're going to get a lot of questions about correcting sentences and what would be the appropriate word to use. The second most common is going to be writing conventions and then organization of ideas. Okay. Now, when we go beyond that and we want to break down where the writing questions are, most of your writing questions are going to be at a DOK level 2 or a DOK level 3. So if you notice, you're not going to get a lot of high level questions. That's why you get so little time to work on this. Most of your questions are going to be a little bit harder than reading something and remembering what you read. It's going to be because that's a level 1. Most of your questions are going to be at a level 2. In writing, 37% is a level 2, 46% is a level 3. So you're not going to get a bunch of, there's actually 4 levels for writing. You're not going to get a bunch of level 4s, and you're not going to get a bunch of level 1s. So you're not going to get too many simple questions. You're also not going to get too many hard questions either. Okay. And then they show you there how they give you points for the essay. We're not going to go too deep into that because we already talked about that yesterday. But this is a good resource for you guys to use at home. So if you're wondering how the essay is going to be graded, because I gave you a sample of how they grade essays, but in here, they give you the exact way that an essay should be written and the exact way that it's going to be graded. Okay. Now, they say not to repeatedly use the same sentence structure. That is true. Don't always say according to the text. You can say in the text, or you can repeat what somebody else already said. Now, when it says do not rely too heavily on the text provided, I disagree with that. Especially if English is not your first language, I would rely on the text for spelling. So I would use the same words that they're using, and I would quote directly from the text. And remember the structure of the essay, right? Because the do not forget to write an essay, that's on slide 55, that is important. Some people just start writing their own opinions. That's not the way we write an essay. What's the very first part of the essay? What's the very first paragraph called?
Introductory.
Correct. The introductory paragraph. What are the next 3 paragraphs called?
Body.
And the last paragraph?
Conclusion.
The conclusion. Okay. And what is the most important sentence in your essay? I wrote it in all capital letters. The thesis. Okay. And what comma do we use when we're writing our thesis?
Comma in series.
Comma in a series. How many points do we want in our thesis?
At least 3.
At least 3. Why?
Because we need 5 paragraph essay altogether.
Correct.
So we need 3.
Yes. Now, Under the dues, they talk about acknowledge the counterclaim. Okay, because they know that most likely you're going to get an essay that's on persuasive writing. So a counterclaim is whatever the other person is arguing. So if you are talking about school uniforms and you're saying that schools should have them, you need to look at why we shouldn't have them and disprove it, attack it. Okay. They do want to see that. You should be doing that in your body paragraphs where you're looking at whatever reasons they gave for having uniforms and you argue the opposite. So, whatever side you pick, you need to criticize the side that you did not pick. Any questions about that?
No question. No question. No question.
There she goes.
Okay. And they actually break down the scoring guide that's on 55. 55 through 59 tells you exactly how to get a 4 and things like that. It's not dramatically different than what we talked about in person or what we talked about in class. They even give you some good words to use, some ways to transition. So from 55 to 50, it's about 60. They're even giving you keywords to use if you want to move from one thing to the other. So that's yours to keep. Okay. Now, what almost everybody's always afraid of is the math section. So if you go to slide 69, this is where they tell you 45% of the math test is going to be algebra.
Yes.
All right.
Yes.
So I just keep hitting that so that nobody's ever surprised. Okay. Every other section is 55%. Okay. So together, every other section is barely more. Okay. All right. So that's 45%. Numbers and operations, everybody should smoke. That's like multiplying, adding, subtracting, nothing too crazy. Measurement and geometry, we didn't hit geometry too much, but honestly, what you're getting in Aztec is going to be enough to pass geometry. So geometry is going to be a lot of like looking at a graph and a shape, and if the shape were to move this way, where would it be? Aztec should be, whatever Aztec gives you should be fine. All right. Data analysis and probability and statistics. That's going to be a lot of looking at how likely something is to happen and looking at a graph and looking for trends. I would say if you're running out of time, I probably wouldn't dedicate anything to probability and statistics. Numbers and operations, you should be fine in. Geometry, I would spend some time in. I know that we have a lot of things going on. Data analysis and probability and statistics is the best way to manage your time. Questions about that?
No question.
Okay.
No question.
Good. Now, when on this is slide number 70. When we look at the different levels, the different DOK levels in math, 73% of the questions are going to be level 2. Okay. Now, the nice thing too is that 20% of the math questions are going to be level 1, meaning very quick, multiply these 2-digit numbers by this 2-digit number, you should be flying through those, right? That's 20%. So nearly 93% of the questions for the math are going to be level 1 or level 2. That's higher and, in my opinion, easier than every other section. So that's why a lot of times when people are like, oh, I'm surprised I passed the math and how did that happen, etc. That's because they weren't looking at, that's because they don't understand the test. Most of the test is not going to be a level 3. You're not going to be like correcting people's problems or things like that. A lot of it is going to be simple math and 2-step equations. And it's multiple choice. Questions on that?
No question.
No, no question. Yeah.
Sorry. Give me one sec. Okay. Anyway, getting back. And they start giving you some examples of the math there. I would spend some quality time with that because the more you get used to the way the questions are presented, then the more confident you're going to be. And 70 through 78 is going to give you a lot of sample questions. Actually, no, I'm sorry. Those sample questions go all the way through to 90. Okay, so they have some practice tests that you can take. There, you can pay for. We also have practice tests. I'm going to be honest. I would do the free interactive practice tests. I do not recommend, again, and I've said this before, if you can afford to pay for the test, just take the test. Okay, a lot of things can change, and I don't want anybody not taking the test because they shut down the testing center or something like that. So if you can afford it, just take it. Whatever you actually pass, you actually passed. People get really excited when they pass a practice test and then they never take the real test. I've seen that happen 1,000 times. So just take the actual test. So whatever you earned, you can keep. Let's see if there's anything else. Okay. And that's pretty much, go ahead.
One question about reading.
Uh-huh.
Do you have any technique to read like a little bit, like tell me how to read
Faster?
fast?
Yes.
Yeah, and understand that because my problem is reading comprehension.
So here's what I would do. There's a couple of ways to make it so that you can read faster. The first thing I would recommend to do is I would look at sight words. In fact, I'm going to send you guys, I'm going to email out a list of sight words for high school.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Sight words are 80% of the words you would see in a 12th grade book or a 12th grade text. If you memorize those, then you're going to be in a good position to quickly read. So that literally is going to help out your fluency. you'll be able to read and you know the words. So this is 80% of the words you're going to see in a 12th grade book. The other side of that is to read and predict. As you are reading, try to predict what's going to happen next. You're going to get better at it. And as you get better at it, you're going to take less time, especially for fiction. You know the pattern that a fiction story has to follow. Take advantage of that. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, I'm going to see.
You know, one more is reading.
What's that?
I need only one more is reading.
You got it. I guarantee that you have it. Guarantee it. You do well on the reading here, and what we're doing is a lot harder than what you're going to do on the test. So when you take notes and you try to predict what you're reading, you're going to read faster.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I'm going to get you guys the list here. Okay. So these are Fry's sight words. This goes all the way from 1st through 10th.
1st to 10th grade?
Yeah. I'm going to see here. Hopefully they don't give it to me as a PDF. Hopefully they give it to me as a web link that I can send out to you. And also, if you want to improve your the speed at which you read, practice exactly the way you're going to take the test. So the packet I just sent out to you has sample passages. Time yourself as you're reading, right? See how long it takes you to take notes, read, and predict. And then see how accurate you are when you're predicting. Right? The more practice you have with that, the faster you're going to be. I'm definitely going to send you guys this list. All right. My computer's like super slow. Shh. Okay, I'm going to open it in PDF here. Okay. So while I'm opening that up, any other questions about the test, when you can take it, strategies, anything like that?
No question.
No question.
¿No tienen ninguna pregunta?
No, bueno, yo tengo una.
Sí.
Para agendar el examen, nos comunicamos con Michael, ¿verdad?
Exactamente, sí.
Okay.
Okay. All right. And then something else that I've brought up before that also helps out with reading is remember that you don't have to take notes in English. The notes can be in your own language. That's something else that's going to help out, right? Because if you're trying to predict and then you're like, wait a second, what's going to happen here? And then you're trying to find the words in English, that's going to eat up time. So if you need to write it in your own native language, that's fine. In fact, that's going to connect you closer to the text. And that's what we're looking for. Text. Does anybody feel like they're going to fail? Because I know that confidence is definitely the other part of that. Anybody not feel confident? Anybody not going to take the test after this class?
I'm going to take the test, but I don't know when. Maybe July or August, because I want to spend more time to read and practice more on aspects.
Okay. So, if you're trying to build up your reading confidence, then I would definitely recommend taking the practice test for reading. Practice on Aztec, really focus on reading. And then the next thing that I would do is I would take the practice test. So that's going to expose you to the standards, and in the whole history of CSN, it's like 97% of people who pass a practice test pass the actual test.
Yeah.
Right, so that should build some confidence as well, especially if you only need that one section. Do you feel more comfortable? Go ahead.
Yes, I will do that with social studies and science because I don't know.
Well,
anything about this.
yeah, science is going to be reading comprehension. Like you saw on the paper, most of the questions are like level 2. So you're not going to get like crazy science questions like chemical compounds and how to make them stable and isotopes. You're not going to get too much of that. For social studies, what I gave you is pretty much it. As long as you understand that there's going to be a long fight for freedom and limiting the power of the government, you're going to be good when it comes to the social studies portion.
For my in the science, it's more easy because the text is short and easy to understand. Just not long as
Correct.
reading comprehension.
Have you taken any of the tests? I think Mariana that was talking. Have you taken any of the tests? Math,
No.
science, or anything?
No, not yet.
Okay.
No.
So I wouldn't
Yo me
dedicate.
siento-
Go ahead.
Todavía no sé, voy a hablar con Michael para ver cuándo es el siguiente, pero voy a hacer el HiSET, no voy a hacer el testing test, y voy a ver cómo me va. Creo que en matemáticas sí lo paso y también en reading and writing.
Si pasas el examen de reading and writing, vas a pasar el examen de ciencia y también de la historia.
Ojalá.
No, sí es.
Voy a hacer,
Sí,
lo voy a hacer, solo voy a hablar con Michael para programarlo.
Yo te recomiendo que tomas el examen de verdad y que no tomas el examen de práctica.
Sí, voy a hacerlo de verdad.
Yeah. So we're talking about the fact that she felt like she wasn't really going to do well in the social studies or the science. But again, it's a reading comprehension test, and American history is not that intricate, right? What I mean by that is, like, for example, my family comes from the Dominican Republic, and they've had like a wild history, right? Like they were taken over, for example, by the Haitians for like hundreds of years, and Haiti was the first country to kick out their masters, right? And then they went under like the Spanish Empire, and then they went away from the Spanish Empire. Then they came back to the Spanish Empire, the only country in Latin America to ever do that. Then they had a dictator for 40 years. Like the history is way more complicated than American history, right? For example, like if you're looking at Mexican history, that's going to be more complicated than American history, right? They also had a dictator. They were inspired by the American Revolution and named their country the United States of Mexico. There's indigenous people that don't even like belong to the government and they do their own thing. It's way more complicated than anything you'll ever get here. Because even if you get a text where it's asking you about states' rights, given what I told you, you should be able to infer what that means, right? So let's take that as an example. What do we mean by states' rights? States' rights. What does states' rights mean in terms of the government?
Los derechos estamos hablando de derechos del Estado, ¿verdad?
Exactamente. ¿Y por qué crees que cuando estamos hablando de la historia de los Estados Unidos, tienen como 3 o 4 capítulos dedicados a los derechos de los estados.
Porque se rigen de acuerdo a cada estado.
Exactamente.
Entonces cada estado tiene sus propios derechos
y el gobierno federal le puede quitar esos derechos.
¿A los estados?
Sí.
No.
Exactamente. Entonces, ya con el ejemplo que le di y lo que usted sabe antes de entrar a clase, no se va a confundir con ninguna de esas preguntas. So we talked about states' rights. So what she said was states' rights are things that the states can do that the federal government can't take away from them. And that's true. And why do you think that we have that? That's actually one of the amendments. Why do you think that we separated the power of the federal government from the power of the states? Why don't we just have, like what the rest of the world has, one government that just tells every other level of government what to do? And I repeat it in Spanish. ¿Por qué no tenemos un sistema de gobierno en que, por ejemplo, como todo el mundo, que el gobierno a nivel federal tiene todos los derechos y le puede decir a todos los otros gobiernos, por ejemplo, del estado o de un pueblo, qué pueden hacer o qué no pueden hacer? Porque aquí en este país tenemos esa diferencia, que el gobierno a nivel federal tiene algunos derechos y el gobierno a nivel del estado tiene derechos apartes de lo que tienen derechos, de los derechos que tiene el gobierno federal. ¿Por qué tenemos ese sistema?
No estoy segura, es porque, bueno, cada estado se elige de manera independiente y de acuerdo a las necesidades políticas de cada estado, es como se han hecho los...
Ok, entonces vamos a pensar en la historia de los Estados Unidos. ¿Quién estaba encargado de la mayoría de los estados y las territorios de los Estados Unidos? Antes que el Estados Unidos existió como gobierno, ¿quién estaba encargado de la tierra? Antes de las personas indígenas. Digo, perdón, después de las personas indígenas y antes que llegó el gobierno de los Estados Unidos, ¿quién estaba encargado de la tierra?
Inglaterra era quien
Exactamente.
quién podía poseer la tierra.
¿Y quién fue el líder? No importa el nombre, pero ¿qué título tenía el líder de Inglaterra?
El rey.
¿Y quién tiene más poder que el rey?
Nadie.
¿Sí me entiendes? Entonces aquí, ¿quién tiene todo el poder?
De aquí se supone que el presidente, bueno, ahora
Sí.
el presidente.
Pero sí ves como el presidente no tiene todo control y no puede, por ejemplo, decir cada cosa que va a hacer un estado, porque el gobierno federal tiene límites.
Sí, no, y por eso, exacto, y por eso hay un representante de cada estado en la Cámara.
Sí, esa es la diferencia entre un rey y el presidente. So we're talking about the fact that states' rights exist so that nobody in this country can have absolute power, right? So, for example, the president can pardon somebody if the criminal activity is at a federal level, if it's at a federal charge. But if you're charged by the state, the governor has to forgive you or pardon you. The president can't do that, right? If the president says you need to tell us where all the quote unquote illegal immigrants are, or we're not going to give you money for highways, the states can say, we'll find our own money for highways. We're not going to work with the federal government, right? So nobody can ever be all powerful. And that comes back again to the fact that when we started off as a bunch of colonies, we had a king. Who does the king answer to? Who does the king answer to? That shouldn't be a hard question. Who does a king answer to? Who's in charge of a king?
¿Quién está a cargo del rey?
Exactamente.
Nadie más arriba del rey.
Yes, no one is in charge of a king. That's why we always separate power in this country, so nobody can be any kind of king. Power is always separated. Remember, when they came from Europe, that's not the way things were. Power was held by one or two people, and then they kind of let other people have a little bit of that power. So that's why when we created a government, the power was separated. Right? So keep that in mind. There's going to be a big struggle between making sure no one's all powerful and that people are able to get land and make money. As long as you understand that, there's not going to be any limit to what you'll be able to do on the test, because that's all of American history.
Okay.
So
Thank you.
make sense? Yeah, you're very welcome, right? So just keep those things in mind, right? So that's why we have a Bill of Rights. Who can take away the Bill of Rights? And this might be a harder question. The Bill of Rights, the right to freedom of speech, the right to bear arms, the right to have a speedy trial, the right to be judged not by like nobles and knights and people that are rich, but the right to be judged in a jury by people that are just like you. Who can take those powers away or those rights away? And if you don't know, tell me you don't know. Nobody can take it away. Not the president, not the governors. Nobody can take that away. Why do you think they would make it so some rights can never be taken away? Why would the government do that? I'll say it in Spanish as well. ¿Por qué crees que el gobierno tiene 10 ¿por qué crees que existen leyes que el gobierno, no importa el nivel federal o del estado, no puede quitar 10 derechos que nos dieron cuando este país se creó? ¿Por qué crees que no dieron esos derechos?
Para mantener la igualdad de los ciudadanos.
Exactamente. So, what Mariana said was that they did that so that everyone has equal rights. And that's exactly why nobody can change the Bill of Rights. So that nobody, again, will ever have ultimate power, right? So everything is about dividing up power, giving people the freedom to be able to pursue their life the way they want to, right? Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? So those are going to be those reoccurring themes. Nobody can be all powerful. The government can't tell you what to do in every single instance, right? So keep that in mind if you're a little nervous about the social studies test. But if there are no questions, that's all I got.
There's no question for me.
Okay.
No, I don't have questions.
Okay. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No question.
Okay. So I recommend reaching out to Michael, scheduling a day to take the test. All right.
Now, do you know that 10 are the CSM the open or?
Yeah, that's going to be on Michael because the governor is not moving us to phase 3. Some states even went back to like phase 0, where they're like not almost like putting people back in quarantine. So to see what the latest guidance is, you'd have to talk to Michael. And that's why I recommend taking the test, because we could go backwards. We could go back to nobody taking the test or taking it online or at home or whatever crazy process they want to use. So he's going to be your best point of contact, and that's why I always recommend take the test as soon as possible.
Okay, thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
Thank you.
Very welcome. It was an honor being your teacher. I know you guys are going to do well. Take the test. If you have any other major questions, feel free to shoot me an email.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you for everything. Have a good summer. Stay safe.
You too. All right. Enjoy your guys' weekend. Bye.